This is the Carlin Studio. I am your host, Charles Lathrop, and today I wanted to talk to you guys about Europe and the condition that it's in, specifically France. Now, it's hard to get information, reliable information, because most of the European media is not exactly forthcoming with details about what's going on. But from what I can glean, the situation is extremely bad. And the situation in France is particularly worst of all. Not the least of which because the French seem to be the least interested in doing anything about it. At least as far as the people who are most likely to know can tell. It doesn't seem like they're really rising up. We've seen the Germans rising up in Chemnitz, and we've seen that the Swedes and the British are starting to push back against what's being done to them, and the Italians are pushing back in a big way, and the Austrians are pushing back. And we see all of these things happening, but we don't really see anything going on in France in the same way. Now, it seems pretty clear to me that the French elections are being rigged, and it's possible that they've been rigged for a long time. And the reason I say that is because I'm pretty sure most of the elections in the West have been rigged for a while, at least since the 1960s or 70s. Now, of course, this isn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't massive election stealing in one day, but there is a group in the background, the globalists, the people who are running the EU, and the people like George Soros and others who have been slowly getting their tendrils into the election process of most Western nations. And you know that this is pretty clearly the case whenever you look at 2016 election and 2012 election, where there was massive election fraud. In some places we're having, greater than 100% of the county voting in the election. Now, and also in my home state of New Mexico, we allow illegal immigrants to vote in our elections, and it's just tolerated and nobody does anything about it, which is another form of election fraud. And similar, other problems, but problems that produce a similar effect can be seen in the Swedish elections and others, where it's not really a secret ballot, or there are other issues going on. And of course all of this feeds the globalist agenda, because they don't want the Republic to maintain the rule of law. They want the mob, or the elites who can control as much of the mob as they can get on there, as they can brainwash, to go with whatever seems to feel good at the moment, which, since they control the media, whatever seems to feel good at the moment is whatever the media tells you feels good, and whatever the media tells you is moral. So we have now in Europe and the United States large groups of the population who think that bringing in a whole bunch of people from other cultures and other parts of the world is a moral good and a necessity, that it's our responsibility for some reason to take care of these people and look after their interests, even though they're not our people and they're not from our country and they have nothing really to do with us other than sharing a species. Now, you may think that's enough, but the fact of the matter is the resources of the West are limited, and the resources of France and the United States and Britain and other places are limited, and the space is limited. And so even if all of these people were behaving themselves and obeying the laws, which they're not, we wouldn't be able to take them all in, because they're simply overwhelming our system. And then you add on, they're not behaving. They're not obeying the laws. They're not respecting the law. And of course, why would they, when the globalists control the governments and the governments are not enforcing the law? Nobody's enforcing the law. Especially in Europe, nobody is cracking down on these people who are misbehaving. They're not taking the steps necessary to prevent this stuff from happening. It's just happening and happening and happening and happening. And so you get big vigilante groups arising up in places like Finland and Germany. One group I've heard of is the Sons of Odin. I believe that's what they're called. And, whatever you think about Islamic immigration or the globalists or any of this other stuff, like, let's just get one thing straight. You don't get vigilante groups if the people are enforcing the law. If the police and the government are actually enforcing the law, vigilante groups don't happen. Ever. They don't happen. Because there's no need for them. Whenever you get the common man rising up and forming vigilante groups, that is proof, beyond proof, that the police are not doing their job. It's really not a point that anyone can debate. Okay? If you understand what it means when there are large vigilante groups, you understand that this is no longer something that people can cover up if they're honest. Right? You can always lie about it and, throw out whatever kind of garbage fabrications you want, but if you're honest about this, the existence of any noteworthy vigilante groups is proof the government is not enforcing the law. And according to French people that I have heard from on the internet and other places, the situation in France has been boiling up since the 1980s, and they start bringing in large numbers of people, Arabs and Africans, and many of these people are Muslims, and so of course they don't assimilate into French culture and they don't become French. And of course, why would they? Especially whenever you bring them in large numbers. And so this is part of assimilation. It's like even if they were willing to assimilate, whenever you bring them in such large numbers, you make it impossible for them to assimilate. If you want to have a successful immigration policy, you have to bring in very small numbers of people at a time so that they don't form enclaves. Because whenever they form enclaves and they form their own distinct communities, because there's so many of them coming in at a time, then they don't have to learn the language. They don't have to learn the language, they don't have to integrate into the culture, they don't have to do any of that stuff, they just form their enclave. And then the enclave gets bigger, and since the government has already established that they're not going to enforce the law, there's no need for these enclaves to obey the law. They establish their own laws inside of their enclaves, and then you have little independent states within your country made up of foreign nationals, essentially, who have no loyalty to your government, no affection for your nation, and no respect or regard for your traditions or your values. And so the inevitable result of this is going to be violence. And I don't mean to say that these people who are coming in are necessarily inherently violent, which of course they are, but the problem is even deeper than that. If they were just, other Europeans, if they're just, Russians in the Ukraine, it's like, they're not going to be loyal to Ukraine, right? They're not inherently violent just because they're Russians, or just because the Russian culture is inherently violent. But they're not going to be loyal to the Ukraine. And if you get big enclaves, they're going to want to be part of Russia. Similar issues have happened throughout history where the presence of a large groups of foreign nationals has led to international problems. And, where do the borders lie? The Sudeten crisis before World War II is a perfect example of this. There's a large number of Germans living in the Sudetenland in what is now the Czech Republic, or Czechia, and it was a perfect excuse for the Nazis to come in and annex the Sudetenland and then annex all of Czechoslovakia, essentially. And the Russians that live in the Ukraine, that live in Crimea, are Russians that were specifically imported by the Russian government to settle in the Crimea. They're not originally native to Crimea. They were brought in by the Tsars so that Russia would always have a reason to go back there. And voila, they always have a reason to go back. And so whenever you bring in huge numbers of Turks or huge numbers of any people, there's always a reason for that nation or that culture to produce separatism and civil strife and interfere with your politics and just be a big headache for everyone. I mean, Quebec has always been kind of a headache for Canada, and it's not because the French Quebecians are particularly violent or particularly, lawless. It's just that they're not British like the rest of the country, or at least like the rest of the country used to be. And so as a result, there's tension, there's friction. This is the natural thing that happens whenever you try to force different people to live together. And you really can't go any further than Yugoslavia if you want examples of how this kind of Balkanization, because it's the Balkans, that's literally where the word comes from, because it's the quintessential example of Balkanization. You have a bunch of different groups of people with different languages and, closer related languages, but still different languages, different cultures, different ethnic backgrounds, and you force them all to live under the same government and they all hate each other. And then it turns into a giant war and they're all murdering each other all over the place. And all of this could have been avoided if you just kept people separate from each other so that the tension is not right in their faces all the time. There's a border, there's a line, we all know what the rules are. And everyone can live under the laws that they want for their own people. And they don't have to argue with each other and argue with people who have different values about what the laws should be. And, we see now in the southwestern United States this massive influx of illegal immigrants, which is why Trump got elected, and they're primarily from Mexico. And there's nothing wrong with Hispanics just because they're Hispanic. Of course not. But whenever you have so many Spanish-speaking people who are Mexican nationals or Mexican descent coming in, where they're overwhelming the local population, you give that 2 or 3 generations, and in 50 or 80 or 100 years, you're going to have a civil war on your hands. Because suddenly, the whole southwestern United States doesn't even speak English. They're not Anglo, they're Hispanic, they're Mexican Hispanic. And they speak Spanish. And they start asking themselves, why do we have to be part of the United States? We're Mexican anyway, we might as well be part of Mexico. So this is just an inevitable result of this kind of mass migration. And you can see it throughout history whenever you talk about the Roman Empire, the Vandals, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Huns, etc. ad nauseum. The Franks, and then into England, after the Romans left England, the local Britons brought in the Angles and the Saxons, and then the Angles brought in the Frisians, and there was a big war with them, and then the Romans brought the Irish into Wales, and then there was a war about that, and it's like, this is not a trend that is going to stop. This is not a pattern that is going to stop happening. It happens every time. If you bring in huge numbers of people from a foreign tribe, there's going to be conflict and civil strife and war. You cannot force people to blend together. Not without brainwashing them and rigging all their elections, apparently. It's never ended well in history. Ever. It's never ended well. Whenever the Hebrews went into the Palestine, what is now called Palestine, whenever they went into the Holy Land, the Hebrew homeland, what became the Hebrew homeland, they drove out or exterminated every people that was in the area. Well, part of the reason that they exterminated some of these cultures is because they were practicing child sacrifice and human sacrifice of various forms, and worshiping Baal and Moloch and all of that nonsense. So the Hebrews came in and they're like, well, this is totally unacceptable. we're going to wipe this out completely because we can't tolerate this. And we can't tolerate you people living in the same place where we're going to live, because if you are here, you're going to be a thorn in our side forever. And in the scriptures, it actually says there was one particular group, or there were several groups, that as the Hebrews became more powerful in the region, they decided to stop completely taking out the other groups. And even though God had told them to take them out, and God was like, okay, you don't want to do what I tell you to do, you don't want to deal with these other groups, they're going to be a thorn in your side forever. They're going to be a thorn in your side for the rest of time, because you didn't wipe them out whenever you were supposed to. They're going to live here now forever, and they're always going to be a pain in the neck to you from now on, forever. Does that sound familiar? Because it sounds familiar to me. I mean, surely I don't need to explain, how the current situation is developed, because people don't understand the value of human life, all human beings being equal before the eyes of God, does not magically make national and cultural identities become irrelevant. It doesn't just cause those things to evaporate into thin air. You can't treat these things like they don't exist. They do exist, and you have to deal with them realistically. Okay? We can't just say, oh, it would be great if we could all just get along and live side by side all the time. And yeah, it would be great, but that never happens. Ever. No culture or people or time period in history has ever been able to pull that off without conflict, or without one of the cultures becoming dominant and basically is subsuming all the others. There are certain examples where two groups live together. The Mitanni and the Hurrians lived together in the ancient Middle East for a time, but the Mitanni were a very, very small minority. The culture was pretty much homogeneous because 90% of the population was Hurrians. The Mitanni were just the leadership class. And in that situation, where 99% of the people are Hurrians, you don't get enclaves, because they're all one group. The Medes and the Persians were thick as thieves for the longest time, until they weren't, and the Persians rose up and wiped the Medes out. That's why it's called Persia. There is no media anymore. It doesn't exist. And so, whenever you take something like France, that has tried since the 1980s or earlier to make people who are not French, or just to tolerate people who are not French within the borders of their homeland, you take them and then you make the foreigners Muslims on top of all of the other problems that already exist just naturally, and you have a recipe for total disaster. And that's exactly what's coming, because they're not enforcing their own laws, and their people are no longer placing value or emphasis on French identity or French values or French culture. And as a result of this, their nation is suffering enormous internal strife, and is going to start spiraling out of control in a big way in the very near future if something really serious isn't done to stop this. And this brings me to my final point, because I want to make it clear that things are very bad. But that doesn't mean that things are over. That it's all over and we're all going to, that's the end of France, or that's the end of the United States. A lot of people have made those kinds of predictions. But these forces are not necessarily inevitable. And these problems that we face are not necessarily fatal. They're not necessarily fatal. Now, you may say, well, how can they be reversed? Various ways. It depends on time and place, and it's kind of beyond the scope of this video. But It can be done. These things can be reversed. And kind of on a side note, some French and some Americans have started talking about partitioning their countries, splitting up the countries so that making new borders and allowing the people who have come in to have their own groups, their own places with new borders and separating out the country. And this is not a solution because they're never going to stop. You draw the southwestern United States off from the rest of the country and you make it part of Mexico, and then there's another wave of immigration in a couple hundred years, and then the Midwest is full of Hispanics who all only speak Spanish, and then they want to be part of Mexico. It never ends. Partitioning these countries is not a good solution because it just delays the inevitable. We have to stop it now. We have to win now. And it can be done. How it can be done, beyond the scope of this video, but it can be done. And the reason I say it can be done is because it has to do with the way you think about it. It sounds cliche whenever you say it so simply, but it's not over until you believe that it's over. When the Carthaginians were invading Italy, when Hannibal Barca was marching through Italy, he destroyed Roman army after Roman army after Roman army after Roman army. I mean, he butchered everything that they put in front of him. He killed tens of thousands of Romans. Just wholesale slaughter. Every time he met a Roman army, it was the same story. And it actually got worse every time, and culminated in the Battle of Canaan, the worst military disaster, or the greatest military victory, depending on who you ask, of all time. And the devastation was so great that there wouldn't have been a single family in all of Rome that didn't lose at least one person. Probably more than one person. Because that's how bad their defeat was. That's how many people they lost. It would have been a huge percentage of their population, and just in total numbers. Just in total numbers, it's more than, many modern wars. The number is staggering. It's like somewhere over 40,000 people in one battle in one day. And that's more than we've lost in Iraq and Afghanistan combined in the entire time we've been there. It's an insanely huge number, especially compared to modern standards, and especially considering the percentage of their population that it was. And these people kept fighting for 12 years after suffering the greatest military defeat in history. 12 years. They didn't give up because they knew what giving up would mean. And I don't think modern Western people know what giving up means. I don't think you know what it means. I don't think you know what it means to say, oh, well, they came in, let's just partition the country. Let's not fight about it. Let's not push back. Let's just quit now while we're behind and try to make peace with the situation as it is. I don't think you understand what that means. The Romans understood what it meant. Because if you let the Carthaginians win now, there's no end to it. Once you've paid him the Dane Guild, you never get rid of the Dane. Ever. And just closing, I wanted to read something from just a short excerpt from Machiavelli, because I feel like this is very pertinent. And if I said it was necessary that the people of Israel should be captive so as to make manifest the ability of Moses, that the Persians should be oppressed by the Medes so as to discover the greatness of the soul of Cyrus, and that the Athenians should be dispersed to illustrate the capabilities of Theseus, then at the present time, in order to discover the virtue of the Italian spirit, or read French spirit, or read German spirit, it is necessary that Italy should be reduced to the extremity that she is now in, that you should be more enslaved than the Hebrews, more oppressed than the Persians, more scattered than the Athenians, without head, without order, beaten, despoiled, torn, overrun, and to have endured every kind of desolation. With us there is great justice, because that war is just which is necessary. And arms are hollowed when there is no other hope but in them. Here there is the greatest willingness, and where the willingness is great, the difficulties cannot be great, if you will only follow those men to whom I have directed your attention. Further than this, how extraordinarily the ways of God have been manifested, beyond example. The sea is divided, the cloud has led the way, the rock has poured forth water, it has rained manna. Everything has contributed to your greatness. You ought to do the rest. God is not willing to do everything, and thus take away our free will and the share of glory which belongs to us. So, in closing, God has done everything to secure the victory. It's only ours to seize it. This has been the Carlinian Studio, and God bless.